June 12, 1943, 7:40 in the morning. The Mediterranean sun was already a merciless hammer, climbing a bleached white sky and beating down upon the turquoise waters surrounding the tiny, desolate island of Lampedusa. The air, thick with the scent of salt, wild thyme, and the acrid tang of recently detonated explosives, was a palpable entity. It was an atmosphere of waiting. For the 4,200 Italian and German soldiers of the island's garrison, this was a place of profound isolation, a forgotten rock in a collapsing empire. Their world had shrunk to this barren landscape of limestone cliffs and fortified bunkers, their supply lines, stretching back to a Sicily that was itself bracing for invasion, were severed. Their morale, meticulously chipped away by weeks of relentless Allied bombing, was shattered. They were a ghost garrison, haunted by the specter of an end they all knew was inevitable, yet none dared to speak of. Above them, Royal Air Force Sergeant Sydney Cohen was fighting a desperate, intimate battle of his own. His aircraft, a Fairey Albacore torpedo bomber, was a relic from another time, a biplane, a creature of fabric and wire in an age of sleek, all-metal monoplanes. And it was dying. A recent burst of anti-aircraft fire had ripped through the fuselage with the sound of tearing canvas. Shrapnel had punctured the port wing fuel tank, and the lifeblood of the machine was now a shimmering slick trailing behind them in the morning air. The Bristol Taurus II engine, starved of fuel and sputtering in a ragged percussive rhythm, was threatening to seize at any moment. Below him, the rocky, inhospitable shores of Lampedusa offered the only conceivable chance of survival, a sliver of hope in a vast, unforgiving sea that promised a swift and anonymous death. The situation was, by every metric of military doctrine, utterly dire. Sergeant Cohen and his two crewmen, navigator Flying Officer John Jock Tate and radio operator Sergeant Peter Otway, were out of options. They were 100 miles from their base in Malta, deep within a cordon of enemy territory. The standard operating procedure, drilled into them through countless hours of training, was as clear as it was grim. Ditch the aircraft in the sea, as far from enemy shores as possible. Deploy the inflatable dinghy, and pray. Pray for a rescue that in these contested waters would likely never come. To deliberately attempt a landing on a heavily fortified enemy-held island was not just against protocol, it was an act of tactical insanity. It was a formal, engraved invitation to immediate capture, relentless interrogation, and an indefinite, miserable existence in a prisoner of war camp. Inside the cramped, vibrating cockpit, the air crackled with the static of a dead radio and the unspoken, suffocating fear of three men facing their own mortality. Every instinct, every ounce of Cohen's rigorous RAF training screamed at him to follow the rules, to take the grim but predictable path of self-preservation. Bank away from the island, gain what little altitude the dying engine would grant, and put the nose down into the unforgiving Mediterranean. That was the book. That was the way it was done. But as he wrestled with the controls, his gaze fell upon the island below, and a different, more audacious thought began to germinate in the fertile soil of his desperation. It was a thought so far outside the realm of conventional thinking, a gamble of such staggering odds that it bordered on pure madness. He glanced at his fuel gauge, the needle resting mockingly on the 0 mark. He checked his armaments. He had no bombs left, having delivered his payload on a previous target. His defensive machine gun was empty. He had not even a flare gun to signal his distress. All he possessed was a dying aircraft, 2 terrified crewmates, and an idea.
an idea that would either be the last of his life or the most brilliant of his career. With a steady hand that betrayed none of the maelstrom of doubt and fear in his mind, Sergeant Sydney Cohen made his decision. He would not ditch. He would not run. He would land. He would face the 4,200 enemy soldiers below not as a victim begging for his life, but something else entirely. Something they could never, in 1,000 years, expect. He banked the crippled biplane not away from the island, but directly towards it.
To comprehend the monumental, almost suicidal choice made by Sergeant Sydney Cohen in that moment, one must first look beyond the uniform, beyond the pilot's wings, and understand the man himself. Sydney Cohen was not forged in the crucible of a military academy. He was not the scion of a storied martial dynasty. Born in the bustling, working-class East End of London, his pre-war world was a universe away from the sun-drenched desolation of the Mediterranean theatre. Before the roar of aero engines replaced the rumble of the London underground in his daily life, Cohen was a traveling salesman. His trade was not in the mechanics of war, but in the subtle, complex art of human persuasion. He sold novelty goods, trinkets, gadgets, the small, amusing distractions of a world at peace. His days were spent reading people, gauging their moods, understanding their desires, their hidden fears, and, most importantly, their ingrained expectations. He knew how to craft the narrative, how to present an offer in a way that seemed not just appealing, but inevitable. His was a world of bluffs and bargains, of unshakable confidence and disarming charisma. It was a skill set that on the surface had no conceivable application on the battlefield. But the crucible of total war has a remarkable way of reforging old skills for new, violent purposes. When Cohen volunteered for the Royal Air Force, it was his affable nature and preternatural calm that set him apart. He was not, by his own admission, the most gifted pilot in his squadron. There were others with more instinctive grace at the controls, others with a more aggressive, predatory instinct in combat. But Cohen possessed a unique, invaluable quality, an uncanny ability to remain lucid and analytical under extreme pressure, to see the chaotic chessboard of conflict from a perspective others missed. He saw not just the enemy's physical strength, their gun emplacements, their troop concentrations, but their psychological vulnerabilities. He understood that a soldier's will to fight is a finite resource, a reservoir that can be drained not just by bombs and bullets, but by uncertainty, isolation, and fear. The mission that had brought him to the skies over Lampedusa was a critical component of a much larger, more ambitious undertaking, Operation Corkscrew. This was the Allied preparatory phase for Operation Husky, the full-scale invasion of Sicily, the soft underbelly of Axis Europe. Before the main invasion force could storm the beaches of Sicily, the heavily fortified islands of the Pelagi archipelago, of which Lampedusa was the largest and most formidable, had to be neutralized. These islands, particularly the nearby island of Pantelleria, were a hornet's nest of coastal batteries, radar stations, and airfields, a persistent thorn in the side of Allied naval and air operations in the central Mediterranean. The garrisons there could threaten the flank of the entire invasion. They had to be eliminated.
For weeks, the Allies had subjected Lampedusa and its sister islands to a relentless campaign of attrition, A near-constant procession of RAF Wellingtons and USAAF B-25 Mitchells had rained high explosives upon its fortifications. Royal Navy warships prowled the coastline, their heavy guns adding to the cacophony of destruction. The goal was simple: to bomb the island into submission, to break the will of its defenders before a costly amphibious landing became necessary. This strategy had worked on Pantelleria, which had surrendered just a day earlier, on June 11th, after a punishing bombardment. But Lampedusa's commander, Rear Admiral Ignazio Bonanno, had repeatedly and publicly refused all calls to surrender, vowing to his superiors in Rome that his garrison would fight to the last man. On paper, his force was formidable. Over 4,000 troops, well protected in deep bunkers, with dozens of artillery pieces and anti-aircraft cannons. But the reality on the ground was far different. On board Cohen's crippled albacore, the human element of this grand strategy was playing out in stark, terrifying detail. His navigator, Flying Officer John Jock Tate, was a stoic Scotsman from Glasgow, a former merchant mariner who knew the sea and the stars intimately. He was the anchor of the crew, his calm calculations a bulwark against the chaos of combat. The radio operator, Sergeant Peter Otway, was a young man from the quiet English countryside of Devon, whose calm, steady voice had been a beacon of reassurance on many a perilous flight. Now his radio was silent, the link to their world severed. Together they were a tight-knit crew, a small family forged in the shared terrors and triumphs of aerial warfare. They had faced flak and fighters before, but this was different. This was a slow, inexorable descent into oblivion. As their aircraft lost altitude, the full reality of their predicament became starkly clear. The island below was a pockmarked moonscape, the fresh, raw scars of the Allied bombardment a brutal testament to the fury of the preceding weeks. The panicked radio calls from other aircraft in their squadron had faded into the vast, indifferent ether. Their own frantic pleas for assistance had been swallowed by the static-filled emptiness of the sky. They were utterly, terrifyingly alone. The official plan, the doctrine of sea ditching and rescue, had failed them. Time, altitude, and fuel had run out. And it was in this precise moment of utter desperation, with the rulebook burning in the fires of necessity, that Sydney Cohen, the salesman from London, saw an opening. He saw a customer on the verge of collapse, a client primed for a deal. He was about to make the sale of a lifetime.
As the albacore limped through the sky, its engine a death rattle of protesting metal, Sergeant Cohen's mind, honed by years of reading the subtle tells of a hesitant customer, was now laser-focused on reading the enemy. He forced himself to look past his own imminent doom and observe the island not as a pilot searching for a place to crash, but as a strategist probing for a weakness. He instructed Tate to plot a single wide circle around Lampedusa, a move that must have seemed utterly insane to his crew. They were burning their last few precious drops of fuel not to escape, but to reconnoiter. And then he saw it. It wasn't a tactical flaw in the island's defenses, not a blind spot in their anti-aircraft coverage that a bomber pilot might notice. It was something far more subtle, yet infinitely more powerful, the collective body language of the island itself. He saw the large-caliber coastal guns, formidable and menacing, yet pointing impotently out to a sea devoid of invasion ships. He saw smaller anti-aircraft emplacements, their crews visible, but they were not moving with the frantic, purposeful energy of men under attack. They were lounging, some even standing exposed, watching the lone crippled biplane with a strange, almost lethargic curiosity. The roads that connected the various strongpoints were empty. There were no dispatch riders, no trucks ferrying troops to repel a landing. The smoke from the previous night's bombing raids drifted lazily upwards in the still morning air, a sign of fires that had been left to burn themselves out. This was not the posture of a defiant fortress, a coiled spring ready to strike. This was the exhausted slump of a garrison that had already been defeated in spirit. The relentless bombardment, the severing of their supply lines, the fall of nearby Pantelleria, the constant gnawing uncertainty of their fate, it had all taken its toll. They were not a bastion of resistance. They were a brittle pane of glass ready to shatter at the slightest, unexpected touch. This was Cohen's aha moment. The profound, electrifying realization that he was not flying towards a fight, but towards a surrender that was simply waiting for someone to arrive and accept it. "We're going in," he said over the intercom, his voice betraying none of his inner turmoil. The reply from Tate was a stunned silence, followed by a clipped, "Say again, Sid." Cohen repeated the order, explaining his observation in short, confident bursts. There would be no frantic crash landing, no desperate scramble for survival. They would land on the enemy airfield. They would land as if they were expected, as if they were a diplomatic delegation arriving for a prearranged meeting. It was a plan so audacious, so contrary to every instinct, that its very insanity became its greatest strength. Trusting their pilot, the crew prepared. Otway secured his radio equipment. Tate braced himself. Cohen focused on the most difficult landing of his life. He brought the lumbering biplane in low over the coastline, deliberately flying slow and steady, not like a plane in distress, but like one on a ceremonial approach. He lined up with the island's small cratered airfield, and with incredible skill managed to set the albacore down, bouncing over shell holes before screeching to a halt in a cloud of dust. As the propeller coughed its last, the silence that descended was absolute, profound, and terrifying.
And then they came. From the mouths of concrete bunkers and the cool shadows of fortified positions, Italian soldiers began to emerge, first in ones and twos, then in dozens. They came not with the aggression of men eager to fight, but with a weary, almost hopeful curiosity. They surrounded the battered aircraft, a sea of gray-green uniforms, their rifles held loosely at their sides, their faces a collective mask of confusion, exhaustion, and disbelief. This was the critical moment, the knife's edge upon which the entire bluff rested. A single nervous soldier, a single jumpy officer could have ended it all in a hail of gunfire. From the Italian perspective, the arrival of this lone, antiquated aircraft was a bizarre and inexplicable event. They had been psychologically braced for a massive amphibious assault, a final, overwhelming wave of Allied power. Instead, they were greeted by 3 airmen in a biplane that looked like it belonged in a museum. The sheer, surreal absurdity of the situation created a profound cognitive dissonance. Their brains couldn't process it. They saw not a crippled aircraft, but a messenger. They saw not a desperate pilot, but a confident, almost arrogant envoy. Their own deep-seated fear and bone-deep weariness provided the fertile ground in which Cohen's audacious deception would now take root and blossom. Climbing out of the cockpit, Cohen moved with a deliberate, unhurried grace. He held up his hands, not in the universal sign of surrender, but palms open in a gesture of calm authority. He was not a captive, he was a dignitary. Through a pidgin mix of the few Italian words he knew, elaborate hand gestures, and the universal language of unwavering, supreme confidence, he conveyed a simple, powerful, and utterly false message. The island was completely surrounded by a Royal Navy battle fleet. A massive invasion force was assembling just over the horizon. Further resistance was futile and would result in a catastrophic loss of life.
He was here, as an act of mercy, to accept their immediate and unconditional surrender. He was not asking, he was informing them of a decision that had already been made. The Italian officers, men accustomed to the rigid hierarchies and predictable protocols of military command, were thrown into complete disarray. This was not how a surrender was supposed to happen. There were no formal channels, no radio communications, no white flags, no negotiated terms. There was only this lone British airman, standing calmly amidst the wreckage of their defenses, demanding the capitulation of an entire island. The psychological impact was devastating. In their minds, already primed for defeat, no single pilot would dare to undertake such a mission unless he was backed by an overwhelming force just minutes away. The bluff was no longer a bluff. In their perception, it had become an undeniable reality. What followed was a scene that could have been lifted from a surrealist film. The Italian commandant, after a brief, flustered, and panicked consultation with his subordinate officers, agreed to the terms. A soldier was dispatched to find a bedsheet, which was presented to Sergeant Cohen as a makeshift white flag. The commandant then, with a trembling hand, signed a formal document of capitulation that Cohen had the presence of mind to demand. The Great Escape had seamlessly transformed into the Great Surrender. The lone, unarmed pilot had become the conqueror of Lampedusa. The legend of the King of Lampedusa, as the press would later dub him, was born in that cloud of dust on that cratered runway. Captured enemy soldiers would later report their steadfast belief that the island was on the verge of being overrun by a massive Allied invasion force. They spoke of the British pilot's unnerving confidence, his seeming indifference to their vastly superior numbers. The ghost of an invasion, conjured from thin air by a London salesman, had proven more potent than the reality of a single, crippled aircraft with no bullets left.
The first individuals to truly grasp the magnitude of Sergeant Cohen's surreal accomplishment were not his superiors, safely ensconced in their headquarters on Malta, but the very men he had, in a single, masterful stroke, defeated. As the initial shock of the morning's events wore off, a palpable wave of relief washed over the Italian garrison. It was a release from a tension that had been building for weeks. The young British pilot had not been a harbinger of their destruction, but the unexpected agent of their salvation from a pointless and bloody last stand. An Italian captain, a veteran with tired eyes, approached Cohen as he waited for Allied forces to arrive. He offered the British airman a cigarette, and in halting English expressed a sentiment that transcended the enmity of war. "You have saved many lives today, Signor," he said, gesturing to his own men. "Ours and yours." It was the first and perhaps the most meaningful validation of the profound genius and humanity of Cohen's audacious act. But the world of military command, with its rigid structures and unwavering fealty to the rulebook, is not always receptive to improvisational genius, especially when it deviates so spectacularly from established order. When a Royal Navy destroyer finally arrived to formally accept the surrender and take custody of the prisoners, the reality of what had occurred began to filter back to Allied headquarters. Upon his return to his base in Malta, clutching the signed surrender document that should have been his ticket to a hero's welcome, Cohen was met not with immediate adulation, but with a tense and deeply incredulous debriefing. His commanding officer, a group captain who was a man of charts, plans, and protocols, struggled to process the report laid before him. "You did what, Sergeant?" the officer demanded, his voice a tight coil of astonishment and barely concealed outrage. The formal atmosphere of the debriefing room felt thick with tension. "Let me be perfectly clear. You found your aircraft damaged, you were low on fuel, and you elected to land on an enemy-held island, an action expressly forbidden by standing orders.
He paced behind his desk, his frustration mounting. And then, without any authority, without any communication with this headquarters, you proceeded to accept the surrender of a garrison of over 4,000 men? The words hung in the air, a stark formal indictment of a breach of every conceivable rule of engagement. That is a direct violation of standing orders, Cohen. You abandoned your aircraft in a manner not prescribed by regulations, and you engaged with the enemy in a diplomatic capacity for which you had no authority whatsoever. Do you have any idea of the position you have put us in?
Hurad's defense was not an apology. It was not an excuse. It was a simple, powerful, and irrefutable statement of battlefield necessity. "With all due respect, sir," Cohen replied, his voice calm and steady, his gaze unwavering. "We were out of fuel. The aircraft was no longer a viable asset. Following protocol meant ditching in the sea, which would have resulted in the loss of a 3-man crew and an aircraft. The alternative was a guaranteed outcome, sir. And the enemy, they were ready to give up. It simply seemed a terrible waste of a good opportunity, and a terrible waste of lives on both sides to not take it." His logic, stripped of all military jargon and pretense, was a bucket of cold water on the fire of bureaucratic indignation. What was the alternative he was supposed to have chosen? To have followed the rules to his own death, allowing the garrison on Lampedusa to wait for a bloody and costly invasion that, as it turned out, was no longer necessary? Grudging and then overwhelming vindication was not long in coming. The news of the bloodless capture of the island fortress reached the highest levels of command. A more experienced, higher-ranking officer, an air vice-marshal who understood that war is often a messy, unpredictable affair that cannot be entirely confined to the pages of a manual, intervened personally. The sheer, unadulterated success of Cohen's impromptu mission was too significant, too strategically valuable to be mired in a disciplinary hearing. The capture of Lampedusa, a key strategic objective in the run-up to the Sicily invasion, had been achieved without the loss of a single Allied life, without a single shot being fired in anger, saving untold resources and man-hours. The unofficial praise was effusive, even if the official commendation would have to be more circumspect. There would be no court-martial, no formal disciplinary action. Instead, there was a quiet but firm recommendation for a medal. The reward, when it came, was as unceremonious as the act itself. The Distinguished Flying Medal, a decoration for exceptional valor, courage, or devotion to duty whilst flying in active operations against the enemy, was not presented in a grand parade. It was not pinned to his chest by a general in a blaze of publicity for the newsreels. It was handed to him at a desk. A simple, almost perfunctory acknowledgement of an act that had been anything but simple. This quiet recognition, this conspicuous lack of fanfare, only served to reinforce the unsung nature of his particular brand of genius. He had not sought glory, but had stumbled upon it, armed with nothing more than a malfunctioning airplane and a salesman's uncanny intuition. The ripple effect of his actions, however, was just beginning to be felt. The astonishingly swift and bizarre fall of Lampedusa sent a shockwave through the remaining Axis-held islands in the Mediterranean, a clear and undeniable signal that the will to resist was crumbling, and that the end was near.
The story of Sergeant Sydney Cohen and the bloodless conquest of Lampedusa could have easily become a mere footnote in the sprawling, voluminous annals of the Second World War. It could have been dismissed as a curious anecdote, a one-in-a-million fluke to be shared in smoky officers' clubs and veterans' halls. But the sheer, audacious brilliance of his unorthodox tactic, the weaponization of pure bluff, had a far more lasting and profound impact than anyone could have imagined at the time. In the war's aftermath, as military strategists and tacticians began the monumental task of dissecting the conflict's lessons, the events of that fateful day in June 1943 were quietly studied. What had been a spontaneous act of inspired desperation was now being analyzed in the hallowed, forward-thinking halls of military academies and special operations training centers. It was a subtle but significant shift in doctrine. The Army had long understood the value of large-scale psychological warfare, of propaganda leaflets, broadcast appeals, and strategic deception campaigns designed to erode enemy morale from a distance. But what Cohen had demonstrated was something new, something far more immediate, personal, and dynamic. It was the tactical application of the individual bluff, of using an enemy's own expectations, fears, and bureaucratic inertia against them in a direct, face-to-face confrontation. This thinking led to the quiet integration of what would later be given the dry, technical name, asymmetrical engagement initiatives into the training curricula for elite special operations forces. It was a principle that taught soldiers that sometimes the most effective weapon in their arsenal was not their rifle, but their opponent's perception of what they were capable of. It was a fancy term for a deceptively simple and powerful idea. Don't just fight the soldier, fight his mind. Archived testimonies from the Italian soldiers who surrendered that day provide a powerful, independent validation of Cohen's genius. A junior artillery officer, in a post-war debriefing report, stated, "We had spent weeks preparing for an invasion, for a fight to the death in our bunkers. We had practiced drills for repelling a landing. We were not, however, prepared for a single unarmed British pilot to land and demand our surrender as if it were his divine right. In that moment of complete confusion, he held all the power, and we, with all our guns, held none." A letter from an ordinary Italian infantryman to his family, written from a prisoner of war camp in North Africa, captured the sentiment of the men on the ground with poignant simplicity. "A strange thing happened. The war ended for me not with a bang, but with the arrival of a single brave Englishman in a broken airplane. I do not know his name, but I am grateful to him. He saved us from ourselves, from a death that would have served no purpose."
After the war, Sydney Cohen did not seek the limelight. He did not trade on his wartime exploits. He returned to his quiet, civilian life, a silent hero in a world that was, for a time, eager to forget the heroes of its recent bloody past. He shed the uniform of the Royal Air Force and once again donned the suit of a traveling salesman. The King of Lampedusa was once again a purveyor of novelty goods. The profound contrast between his battlefield audacity and his post-war humility is a powerful testament to the character of the man. He had not been a warrior in the traditional mold, but an ordinary man who, when faced with an impossible problem, had reached into his unique toolkit of life experiences and pulled out a solution no one else could have conceived. One can only imagine him, years later, closing a mundane sale with a difficult client, using a fraction of the same charisma and nerve that had won him an island, a quiet, private smile playing on his lips. It is in a letter to his wife, Eleanor, written in 1978, nearly 35 years after the event, that we find the emotional climax of this remarkable story. It is a final, deeply personal confession from the man behind the legend, revealing the true motivation that drove him that day. "I am often asked if I was afraid that day," he wrote. "And the truth is, I was terrified, beyond anything I had ever known. The engine was failing, the sea was waiting, and an island of enemy soldiers was below. But as I circled, and I saw the faces of those Italian soldiers looking up at me, I saw not a fearsome, monolithic enemy. I saw individual men who were just as tired, just as frightened, and just as sick of it all as I was. They didn't want to die for that barren rock, and I certainly didn't want to be the reason they had to. In that moment, the battlefield taught me something no training manual ever could, that sometimes the only right choice is the one they didn't teach you to make. It was never about being a hero. It was about seeing a chance, however small, to find a better way to end the killing. And maybe that's the real, enduring lesson of Sergeant Sydney Cohen's story. That in the midst of the vast, impersonal chaos and industrial destruction of modern warfare, there are still moments of profound, luminous clarity. Moments where a single individual, armed with nothing more than their wits, their empathy, and their courage, can change the course of history. History doesn't always remember you for what you were ordered to do, but for what you chose to do when no one else would. If you found this story of unsung genius as compelling as we did, be sure to subscribe to WW2 Explained for more cinematic documentaries on the hidden heroes and forgotten battles of the Second World War. And let us know in the comments below what other unsung heroes you think deserve to have their stories told.